A girl of just 12 goes into labor, and what doctors discover is completely unexpected. You may think you've heard stories of young births before, but this shocking diagnosis is unlike anything else. Before we continue, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching this video from. I'd love to know. In the quiet town of Millbrook, nestled among rolling hills and dense forests, life had always moved at a gentle pace. The kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where children played freely in the streets, and where time seemed to stand still. But on that fateful summer day, as the sun climbed high into the cloudless sky, the tranquility of Millbrook was shattered in an instant. The piercing wail of sirens cut through the air, drawing curious onlookers from their homes and shops. At the center of the commotion was St. Mary's Hospital, its emergency entrance a flurry of activity, as paramedics rushed a small figure through the sliding doors. Word spread quickly through the gathered crowd. A child was in labor. Dr. Clara Thompson, the lead obstetrician on duty, felt her heart race as she received the incoming patient. With 25 years of experience under her belt, she thought she had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared her for the sight that greeted her in the delivery room. The girl on the gurney looked no older than 12. Her face, contorted in pain, was round with lingering baby fat. Pigtails, now messy and damp with sweat, framed her cherubic features. But her swollen belly told a horrifying story, one that Dr. Thompson couldn't begin to fathom. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked gently, trying to mask the shock and anger bubbling beneath her professional demeanor. Between labored breaths, the girl managed to whisper, "Lillian Donovan." As the medical team sprang into action, preparing for what would undoubtedly be a high-risk delivery, Dr. Thompson felt a chill run down her spine. In all her years of practice, she had never encountered a case quite like this. The ethical implications alone were staggering. Outside the hospital, the crowd continued to grow. News travels fast in small towns, and within the hour, it seemed all of Millbrook had gathered, their faces a mix of concern, curiosity, and outrage. Among them stood Officer James Parker, his weathered face set in grim determination as he spoke quietly into his radio. "We're going to need additional units," he said, his eyes scanning the increasingly agitated crowd. "And get child services down here, ASAP." As the summer sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot, a dark sedan pulled up. From it emerged a man in his late 40s, his face a mask of panic and confusion. He rushed towards the entrance, only to be intercepted by Officer Parker. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back," Parker said, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. "You don't understand," the man pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. "That's my daughter in there. I need to be with her." A hush fell over the crowd as they watched the exchange. In that moment, the true horror of the situation began to sink in. If this man was indeed the girl's father, then the implications were beyond devastating. Inside the delivery room, Lillian's cries echoed off the sterile walls as Dr. Thompson and her team worked tirelessly. The juxtaposition of the childlike face and the very adult situation created a surreal atmosphere that left even the most experienced nurses shaken. "Push, Lillian," Dr. Thompson encouraged, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "You're doing great, sweetheart. Just a little more." With one final gut-wrenching scream, Lillian gave birth to a healthy baby boy. As the newborn's cries filled the room, a collective sigh of relief washed over the medical team. But the relief was short-lived, as the reality of the situation came crashing back down. Dr. Thompson cradled the infant, marveling at his perfect fingers and toes, while a nurse tended to Lillian. The young girl's eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling with exhausted breaths. She looked so small, so vulnerable lying there on the hospital bed. "Contact the authorities," Dr. Thompson instructed one of the nurses, her voice barely above a whisper. "And get social services here immediately. We need to protect this child, both of them." As word of the successful delivery spread through the hospital and out to the waiting crowd, a mix of emotions swept through the town of Millbrook. Relief that both mother and child had survived the ordeal. Horror at the circumstances that had led to this moment, and a burning desire for justice that threatened to consume them all. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about appearances, judgment, and the complexities of the human experience. Chapter 2. Unraveling Truths. The following days in Millbrook unfolded like scenes from a surreal play, each act more bewildering than the last. The arrest of Thomas Donovan, Lillian's supposed father, sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had known the Donovans for years struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming man with the monster they now believed him to be. At the Millbrook police station, Detective Laura Reeves sat across from Thomas in the interrogation room, her dark eyes studying him intently. She had seen her fair share of criminals in her 15-year career, but something about this case didn't sit right with her. "Mr. Donovan," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. The charges against you are severe. Child abuse, statutory rape. You're looking at spending the rest of your life behind bars." Thomas, his face haggard from sleepless nights and constant questioning, leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "Detective, please," he said, his voice hoarse. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding. Lillian isn't 12 years old. She's my wife, and she's 23. Detective Reeves fought to keep her expression neutral, but inside her mind was reeling. Could this be a desperate attempt to escape justice, or was there more to this story than met the eye? "That's a pretty far-fetched claim, Mr. Donovan," she replied, leaning back in her chair. "Do you have any proof to back up this assertion?" Thomas nodded eagerly, hope flickering in his tired eyes. Yes, I do. Our marriage certificate, Lillian's birth certificate, medical records, they're all at our house. Please, you have to believe me. I would never hurt Lillian. I love her more than life itself." As Detective Reeves listened to Thomas's impassioned plea, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was a piece to this puzzle she was missing. She made a mental note to follow up on his claims, determined to uncover the truth, no matter how unlikely it might seem. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's Hospital, Lillian was recovering from the delivery, her tiny frame dwarfed by the hospital bed. Dr. Thompson had taken a special interest in her case, visiting her room frequently to check on both mother and child. During one such visit, as Dr. Thompson was examining the baby, Lillian spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where's Thomas? Is he okay?" Dr. Thompson paused, unsure of how to respond. The girl's attachment to her abuser was not uncommon in cases like these, but it always broke her heart to see. "Lillian," she said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Thomas is with the police right now. They're trying to understand what happened. Can you tell me a little bit about your relationship with him?" Lillian's brow furrowed in confusion. "Thomas is my husband," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We've been married for 3 years. Why is he with the police? Did something happen?" Dr. Thompson felt a chill run down her spine. The conviction in Lillian's voice was unsettling. Could it be possible that there was more to this story than they had initially assumed? As these scenes played out, the town of Millbrook was in turmoil. News vans lined the streets, reporters clamoring for any tidbit of information about the scandalous case. Social media was ablaze with speculation and outrage, with people from all over the country weighing in on the situation. Amidst the chaos, a small group gathered in the living room of Margaret Donovan, Thomas's elderly mother. Her weathered hands shook as she poured tea for her visitors, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I just don't understand," she said, her voice quavering. "Thomas has always been such a good boy. And Lillian, she's been like a daughter to me since they got married. How could everyone think such horrible things about them?" One of the visitors, a longtime family friend named Robert, leaned forward, his face etched with concern. "Margaret, we believe you, but you have to understand how this looks to outsiders. Lillian. Well, she doesn't look her age. People are jumping to conclusions." Margaret nodded sadly, reaching for a photo album on the coffee table. She opened it, revealing pictures of Thomas and Lillian on their wedding day. To the untrained eye, it looked like a man posing with a young girl in a wedding dress, a sight that would turn anyone's stomach. But Margaret saw something different. "Look at her eyes," she said, pointing to Lillian's smiling face in the photo. "Those aren't the eyes of a child. Lillian has always been different, special. It's not her fault that she looks the way she does." As the group pored over the photos, a spark of doubt began to flicker in their minds. What if there was more to this story than the salacious headline suggested? What if, in their rush to protect a child, they had condemned an innocent couple to a nightmare beyond imagination? Back at the police station, Detective Reeves was beginning to have similar doubts. She had dispatched officers to the Donovan residence to retrieve the documents Thomas had mentioned. As she waited for their return, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering a truth stranger than fiction. Little did she know, the evidence she was about to receive would turn the case on its head, challenging everything they thought they knew about Lillian Donovan and the man accused of the unthinkable. Chapter 3. A Medical Mystery Unfolds. As the sun rose over Millbrook on the third day since Lillian's dramatic arrival at the hospital, the town was abuzz with conflicting emotions. Anger and disgust still simmered beneath the surface, but a new sentiment was beginning to take hold: doubt. At the police station, Detective Reeves sat at her desk, surrounded by a sea of papers. The documents retrieved from the Donovan residence lay spread out before her, each one adding another layer to the increasingly complex case. Her eyes widened as she examined Lillian's birth certificate. According to this official document, Lillian Rose Donovan was indeed born on May 15, 2001. If this was to be believed, she would be 23 years old, just as Thomas had claimed. But how could this be possible? The girl in the hospital bed looked no older than 12. Detective Reeves ran her fingers through her hair, her mind racing. There had to be an explanation. As if on cue, her phone rang. It was Dr. Thompson from the hospital. "Detective," the doctor's voice crackled through the speaker. "I think you need to come down here. There's something you need to see." Within 20 minutes, Detective Reeves was striding through the hospital corridors, her heart pounding with anticipation. She found Dr. Thompson in her office, surrounded by medical textbooks and printouts. "What have you found?" Reeves asked, unable to keep the eagerness from her voice. Dr. Thompson handed her a medical file. "I've been doing some research, trying to make sense of Lillian's condition, and I think I've found something that might explain everything." As Detective Reeves flipped through the file, Dr. Thompson began to explain. "It's called Laron syndrome. It's an incredibly rare genetic disorder that affects growth and development. People with this condition often have a childlike appearance well into adulthood." Reeves looked up from the file, her mind reeling. "Are you saying that Lillian could actually be 23? Dr. Thompson nodded solemnly. "It's not just possible, it's likely. Laron syndrome affects fewer than 350 people worldwide. It's so rare that most doctors go their entire careers without encountering a single case." As the two women discussed the implications of this discovery, across town, a different kind of revelation was taking place. In the cozy living room of Margaret Donovan, a small group had gathered once again. This time they were joined by a new face, Dr. Evelyn Chen, a specialist in rare genetic disorders who had flown in from New York upon hearing about the case. "I've reviewed Lillian's medical history," Dr. Chen said, addressing the rapt audience. "And I can say with near certainty that she has Laron syndrome. It's a condition characterized by short stature, delayed puberty, and a youthful appearance that persists well into adulthood." A collective gasp went up from the group. Margaret clutched a framed photo of Thomas and Lillian to her chest, tears of relief streaming down her face. "So you're saying Lillian really is an adult?" Robert asked, his voice filled with a mixture of shock and hope. Dr. Chen nodded. "Biologically, yes. People with Laron syndrome have normal cognitive development and can lead full adult lives. They just happen to look much younger than their actual age." As this news began to spread through Millbrook, the tide of public opinion started to shift. Those who had been quick to condemn Thomas now found themselves grappling with a new reality, one that challenged their assumptions and forced them to confront their own biases. Back at the hospital, Lillian was sitting up in bed, cradling her newborn son. She looked up as Detective Reeves and Dr. Thompson entered the room, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Lillian," Detective Reeves began gently, "we need to ask you some questions. It's very important that you tell us the truth. Can you do that?" Lillian nodded, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Of course. What do you want to know?" For the next hour, Lillian shared her story. She spoke of growing up with Laren syndrome, of the challenges she faced in a world that couldn't see past her childlike appearance. She talked about meeting Thomas, how he had seen her for who she truly was, not just what she looked like. And she described their life together, the love they shared, and the joy they felt when they learned they were going to be parents. As she listened, Detective Reeves felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, revealing a picture very different from the one they had initially imagined. But even as the truth came to light, new challenges loomed on the horizon. How would they undo the damage that had been done? How would Thomas and Lillian rebuild their lives in the wake of such a public ordeal? And how would society at large respond to a story that challenged their deepest assumptions about appearance and identity? As night fell over Millbrook, these questions hung in the air, unanswered, but for the first time since this ordeal began, there was a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, justice and understanding might prevail in the end. Chapter 4. The Aftermath. The days that followed the revelation of Lillian's condition were a whirlwind of activity in Millbrook. News of Laren syndrome spread like wildfire, transforming the narrative from one of horror and disgust to one of fascination and, in many cases, embarrassment. Thomas Donovan was released from police custody with a formal apology from the department. As he stepped out of the station, blinking in the bright sunlight, he was met not with angry protesters, but with a small group of supporters. Among them was Robert, who stepped forward to shake Thomas's hand. "I'm so sorry, Tom," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "We should have known better. We should have trusted you." Thomas, still reeling from his ordeal, managed a weak smile. "Thank you, Robert. That means a lot." As Thomas made his way to the hospital to reunite with Lillian and meet his newborn son, the town of Millbrook was engaged in a collective soul-searching. How had they gotten it so wrong? How had they been so quick to judge, so eager to believe the worst? At the Millbrook Gazette, Editor-in-Chief Samantha Wright was facing a crisis of conscience. The paper had been at the forefront of reporting on the scandal, its headlines sensational and its editorials scathing. Now she sat at her desk, staring at a blank computer screen, trying to find the words to make things right. Finally, her fingers began to move across the keyboard. To our readers, in our haste to report on a story that shocked and outraged our community, we failed in our most fundamental duty as journalists, to seek the truth. We allowed assumptions and prejudices to cloud our judgment, and in doing so, we caused immeasurable harm to two innocent people. For this, we offer our deepest and most sincere apologies to Thomas and Lillian Donovan, and to our readers who trusted us to provide accurate and fair reporting. The story of Lillian Donovan and her rare condition, Laren syndrome, serves as a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that rushing to judgment can have devastating consequences. As we move forward, we pledge to approach every story with the care, diligence, and skepticism it deserves. We owe it to our community and to the pursuit of truth to do better. Samantha leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She knew that rebuilding trust, both with the Donovans and with the community, would be a long and challenging process. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's Hospital, a touching scene was unfolding. Thomas, freshly released and still wearing the clothes he'd been arrested in, rushed through the corridors, his heart pounding. When he reached Lillian's room, he paused at the doorway, overcome with emotion. Lillian looked up, her face lighting up at the sight of him. In her arms, she cradled their newborn son. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice filled with relief and love. Thomas crossed the room in 3 long strides, enveloping his wife and child in a gentle embrace. Tears streamed down his face as he kissed Lillian's forehead, then gazed down at his son for the first time. "He's perfect." Thomas murmured, gently stroking the baby's cheek. Just like his mother. Dr. Thompson, who had been checking on Lillian, discreetly stepped out of the room, giving the family a moment of privacy. As she closed the door behind her, she found herself face to face with Detective Reeves. "How are they doing?" the detective asked, her voice low. Dr. Thompson sighed. "As well as can be expected, given the circumstances. They're resilient, but they've been through a terrible ordeal. It's going to take time for them to heal, not just physically but emotionally." Detective Reeves nodded, her face etched with guilt. "I can't help feeling responsible. If we had just taken the time to investigate more thoroughly before making assumptions." "We all share some of that responsibility," Dr. Thompson replied gently. "The important thing now is to learn from this and do better in the future." As they spoke, a commotion at the end of the hallway caught their attention. A throng of reporters had somehow made it past hospital security and were clamoring for access to the Donovans' room. Detective Reeves straightened her shoulders. "I'll handle this," she said, striding towards the crowd. As she approached, she held up her badge. "This is a restricted area," she announced, her voice firm. "I'm going to have to ask all of you to leave immediately." One particularly persistent reporter pushed forward. "The public has a right to know the truth about this story," he argued. Detective Reeves fixed him with a steely gaze. "The public has a right to accurate information, which is something you people seem to have little interest in. The Donovans have been through enough. They deserve privacy and respect. Now I won't ask again. Leave, or you'll be escorted out." Reluctantly, the reporters began to disperse. As they left, Detective Reeves couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. Just days ago, she had been convinced of Thomas's guilt. Now, here she was, protecting him and his family from the very media frenzy she had helped create. Back in the hospital room, Thomas and Lillian were lost in their own world, marveling at their newborn son. "What should we name him?" Lillian asked softly, gazing down at the sleeping infant. Thomas thought for a moment. "How about Ethan?" he suggested. "It means strong and enduring. After everything we've been through, it seems fitting." Lillian smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "Ethan," she repeated. "I love it." As they sat together, reveling in the quiet joy of their reunion, neither Thomas nor Lillian was naive enough to believe that their troubles were over. They knew that returning to their life in Millbrook would be challenging. There would be stares, whispers, and likely some lingering doubts. But in that moment, holding each other and their son, they found strength in their love and in the truth that had finally come to light. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their bond stronger for having weathered this storm. Outside the hospital, as the sun began to set on another tumultuous day in Millbrook, a small crowd had gathered. But unlike the angry mob of days past, this group was different. They carried candles and homemade signs offering support and apologies to the Donovan family. Among them was Margaret Donovan, Thomas's mother, her face etched with both joy and sorrow. As she stood there holding her candle aloft, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for her son's exoneration and for the grandson she had yet to meet. The light from the candles flickered in the gathering dusk, a symbol of hope and redemption for a town that had lost its way, but was now finding its path back to compassion and understanding. As night fell over Millbrook, the story of Thomas and Lillian Donovan was far from over. But a new chapter was beginning, one of healing, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love in the face of adversity. Chapter 5. The Road to Healing. In the weeks that followed the dramatic events at St. Mary's Hospital, the town of Millbrook found itself in a state of collective introspection. The initial shock and outrage had given way to a more complex mixture of emotions: guilt, embarrassment, and a newfound determination to make amends. For Thomas and Lillian Donovan, the journey back to normalcy was a challenging one. They had brought their son, Ethan, home to a house that felt both familiar and strangely alien. The curtains were drawn tight against prying eyes, and a stack of unopened mail, much of it hate mail from the days before the truth came to light, sat untouched on the kitchen counter. Lillian spent much of her time in the nursery, caring for Ethan, and finding solace in the simple, pure love of her child. Thomas, meanwhile, struggled with the aftermath of his wrongful arrest. He jumped at unexpected sounds and found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see accusing faces or police officers coming to take him away again. One sunny afternoon, as Lillian was putting Ethan down for a nap, "Text here." As the older woman broke down in sobs, Lillian stroked her back soothingly. "It's okay, Clara," she murmured. "We're all learning and growing from this." This scene, played out in various forms across Millbrook in the coming weeks, marked the beginning of a healing process for the entire community. It wasn't always easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but slowly, surely, bridges began to be rebuilt. At the Millbrook Community Center, a town hall meeting was called to address the events of the past month. The large auditorium was packed, with latecomers forced to stand along the walls. On the stage, Mayor Frank Harrison stood at the podium, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a look of genuine contrition. "My fellow citizens," he began, his voice echoing through the hushed room, "we are gathered here today to acknowledge a grave injustice that occurred in our town. An injustice born not of malice but of ignorance and fear. An injustice that has caused immeasurable pain to two of our own, Thomas and Lillian Donovan." As the mayor spoke, outlining the events that had transpired and the lessons to be learned, the audience listened in rapt attention. Many dabbed at tears, while others nodded solemnly, accepting their part in the collective failure. "Moving forward," Mayor Harrison continued, "we must commit ourselves to being a community that seeks understanding before judgment, that values truth over sensationalism, and that stands united in the face of adversity. To that end, I am proposing the establishment of a Millbrook Diversity and Inclusion Council to ensure that what happened to the Donovans never happens again." The proposal was met with enthusiastic applause, a sign that the people of Millbrook were ready to turn their remorse into action. As the meeting concluded, Detective Laura Reeves made her way through the crowd, her mind racing. She had been grappling with her role in the Donovan case for weeks, the weight of her mistake pressing heavily on her conscience. Now, as she watched her community coming together to right a wrong, she knew what she had to do. The next morning, bright and early, Detective Reeves found herself standing on the Donovans' front porch. Her hand hovered over the doorbell for a long moment before she finally summoned the courage to ring it. It was Lillian who answered, Ethan cradled in her arms. Her eyes widened in surprise at the sight of the detective. "Mrs. Donovan," Reeves began formally, then stopped herself. "Lillian, I owe you and your husband an apology. My rush to judgment, my failure to investigate thoroughly, it caused you both immense pain. I'm here to take full responsibility for my actions and to ask for your forgiveness." Lillian studied the detective's face, seeing the genuine remorse in her eyes. After a moment, she stepped back, opening the door wider. "Why don't you come in, Detective? I think this is a conversation Thomas should be part of as well." As Detective Reeves entered the Donovan home, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The road to healing was long and often difficult, but with each small step, each act of forgiveness and understanding, the wounds began to heal. Outside, the sun shone brightly on Millbrook, a town forever changed by the extraordinary story of Thomas and Lillian Donovan. A town learning, slowly but surely, that love and truth could triumph over prejudice and fear. A town taking its first steps towards becoming a more compassionate, inclusive community for all its citizens. Chapter 6. Turning the Page. As summer gave way to autumn, the town of Millbrook began to settle into a new rhythm. The vibrant reds and golds of falling leaves seemed to mirror the transformation taking place within the community. A shedding of old prejudices, making way for new growth and understanding. For Thomas and Lillian Donovan, life was slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy. Thomas had returned to his job at the local bank, where his colleagues welcomed him back with a mix of awkward smiles and heartfelt apologies. Lillian, still on maternity leave, found herself becoming an unexpected advocate for awareness about Laron syndrome and other rare genetic conditions. One crisp October morning, as Thomas was preparing to leave for work, He paused at the front door, his hand on the doorknob. Lillian, noticing his hesitation, came to stand beside him, little Ethan gurgling happily in her arms. "What is it, love?" she asked gently, resting her free hand on his arm. Thomas turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and lingering pain. "Sometimes," he said softly, "I still can't believe we made it through all of that. That we're here, together, with our beautiful son." Lillian leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her and Ethan, holding his family close. "We made it because our love is stronger than any misunderstanding or prejudice," she murmured. "And because, in the end, the truth always finds a way." As Thomas headed off to work, Lillian settled into her favorite armchair by the window, Ethan nestled against her chest. She found herself reflecting on the events of the past few months and the unexpected turns her life had taken. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, she found herself face to face with Samantha Wright, the editor-in-chief of the Millbrook Gazette. "Mrs. Donovan," Samantha began, her professional demeanor barely masking her nervousness, "I was hoping I might have a moment of your time." Lillian hesitated for a moment, remembering the hurtful headlines and sensationalized stories that had dominated the Gazette during their ordeal. But she also recalled the heartfelt apology the paper had published and the balanced, sensitive coverage they had provided since then. "Of course, Ms. Wright," she said, stepping back to allow the editor in. "And please, call me Lillian." As they settled in the living room, Ethan cooing softly in his mother's arms, Samantha got straight to the point. "Lillian, I've come here today with a proposition," she said, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "The Gazette wants to do a feature story on Laron syndrome and your experiences. We want to give you and Thomas the opportunity to tell your story in your own words." Lillian's eyes widened in surprise. "Our story?" she repeated. Samantha nodded eagerly. "Yes, we believe it could do a world of good, not just for raising awareness about Laron syndrome, but for promoting understanding and compassion in our community and beyond." As Lillian considered the proposal, her mind raced with possibilities. She thought of all the people out there who might be living with rare conditions, feeling isolated and misunderstood. She thought of other couples who might face judgment and suspicion because of appearances. And she thought of Ethan and the world she wanted him to grow up in, a world of empathy and acceptance. "I think," Lillian said slowly, a smile spreading across her face, "that's a wonderful idea. But I'd like to discuss it with Thomas first, if that's all right." Samantha beamed, clearly relieved. "Of course, take all the time you need. And Lillian, thank you for your grace, your forgiveness, and for being willing to share your story." As Samantha left, Lillian felt a surge of excitement and purpose. She couldn't wait for Thomas to come home, to share this new opportunity with him. That evening, as they sat on their back porch, watching the sun set over the hills of Millbrook, Lillian and Thomas discussed the Gazette's proposal. "Are you sure about this, Em?" Thomas asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "It would mean putting ourselves out there again, inviting scrutiny." Lillian took his hand in hers, her eyes shining with determination. "I'm sure, Thomas. This is our chance to take control of our narrative, to help others who might be going through similar struggles. And who knows, maybe by sharing our story we can prevent something like this from happening to someone else." Thomas gazed at his wife, marveling at her strength and compassion. Even after everything they'd been through, her heart remained open, her spirit unbroken. It was one of the countless reasons he had fallen in love with her. "All right," he said finally, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Let's do it, together." Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Lillian worked closely with Samantha and her team at the Gazette, crafting a series of articles that would tell their story in depth. They spoke candidly about the challenges of living with Laron syndrome, the joys and struggles of their relationship, and the harrowing experience of being wrongly accused and vilified. The day the first article hit the newsstands, Thomas and Lillian woke early, both too nervous to sleep. As Thomas went out to grab a copy of the paper, Lillian paced the living room, Ethan watching curiously from his playpen. When Thomas returned, They sat side by side on the couch, the paper spread out before them. The headline read, "Love Beyond Appearances, the Thomas and Lillian Donovan Story." As they read through the article together, tears welled up in their eyes. Seeing their experiences laid out in print, the challenges they'd faced, the love that had sustained them, the painful ordeal they'd endured, and their journey towards healing was both cathartic and empowering. "They did it," Lillian whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They really captured our story." Thomas nodded, pulling her close. "They did, love. And now, maybe it can help others." The response to the article was immediate and overwhelming. The Donovans' phone began ringing off the hook with calls from friends, neighbors, and even strangers, all expressing their support and admiration. Social media buzzed with discussions about the story, with many people sharing their own experiences with rare conditions or mistaken judgments. In the days that followed, Lillian and Thomas found themselves at the center of a growing movement. They received invitations to speak at schools, community centers, and even a regional medical conference. Their story had struck a chord, sparking conversations about appearance, prejudice, and the importance of looking beyond the surface. One particularly memorable event took place at Millbrook High School. As Lillian stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of young faces, she felt a surge of hope for the future. "When you look at me," she began, her voice strong and clear, "what do you see? A child? A young girl? I want you to know that appearances can be deceiving. I'm a grown woman, a wife, and a mother. I have a rare condition called Laron syndrome that affects my growth and appearance, but it doesn't define who I am." As she spoke, sharing her experiences and the lessons she'd learned, she could see the impact her words were having. Students leaned forward in their seats, some wiping away tears, others nodding in understanding. After her speech, a young girl approached Lillian, her eyes wide with a mix of admiration and nervousness. "Mrs. Donovan," she said hesitantly, I have a condition too. It's not like yours, but it makes me look different. I've always been so scared of what people might think or say. But listening to you, it gives me hope." Lillian hugged the girl, her heart swelling with emotion. This, she realized, was why sharing their story was so important. If they could help even one person feel less alone, less afraid, then every difficult moment had been worth it. As autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, the Donovans' life settled into a new normal. They had become reluctant celebrities in Millbrook and beyond, their story serving as a powerful reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the importance of compassion. Ethan grew into a happy, healthy toddler, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that had surrounded his birth. Thomas and Lillian watched him with a mixture of joy and fierce protectiveness, determined to create a world where he would be judged by his character, not his appearance. On a warm day in early summer, almost a year after the events that had changed their lives forever, the Donovans hosted a barbecue in their backyard. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered to celebrate Ethan's first birthday. As Lillian looked around at the smiling faces, Detective Reeves chatting amicably with Dr. Thompson, Samantha Wright playing peekaboo with Ethan, their elderly neighbor Clara helping Thomas at the grill, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Later that evening, as the last of their guests departed and Ethan slept peacefully in his crib, Thomas and Lillian stood on their back porch, arms wrapped around each other. "Who would have thought," Thomas mused, gazing up at the star-filled sky, "that all of this could come from such a difficult beginning?" Lillian leaned her head on his shoulder. "Life has a funny way of surprising us," she said softly. "Sometimes the hardest challenges lead us to our greatest strengths." As they stood there in the quiet of the night, they reflected on their journey, the pain they'd endured, the love that had sustained them, and the unexpected purpose they'd found in sharing their story. They had faced unimaginable trials and emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. In the years that followed, Thomas and Lillian Donovan continued to be advocates for understanding and acceptance. Their story, once a source of scandal and misunderstanding, became a beacon of hope for many. They wrote a book, started a foundation to support families dealing with rare genetic conditions, and never stopped working to create a more compassionate world. And in Millbrook, a town forever changed by their experience, Their story became a part of local lore, a reminder that love, truth, and understanding could triumph over prejudice and fear. It was a lesson passed down through generations, ensuring that the painful mistakes of the past would not be repeated. As for Ethan, he grew up in a home filled with love and in a community that had learned the value of looking beyond appearances. He carried with him the powerful legacy of his parents' journey, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the transformative power of love. In the end, the story of Thomas and Lillian Donovan was more than just a tale of mistaken identity or a rare medical condition. It was a profound reminder of our shared humanity, of the importance of empathy and understanding, and of the incredible capacity for growth and change that exists within every community and every individual. Their journey, born from a moment of crisis, had become a catalyst for positive change, touching lives far beyond the borders of their small town. And though challenges would always exist, Thomas and Lillian faced the future with hope, secure in the knowledge that their love, a love that had weathered the storm of prejudice and emerged stronger, could overcome any obstacle. As the stars twinkled overhead and the gentle breeze carried the promise of a new day, Thomas and Lillian Donovan held each other close, grateful for the life they had built and the lessons they had learned. Their story, once marked by pain and misunderstanding, had become a powerful testament to the triumph of love, truth, and the indomitable human spirit.